All right, so today we're going to be introducing two new concepts, an array and the for loop. So unfortunately, because of the way our game is, we kind of have to introduce these two things together. They don't always work together, right? You can use them separately. But the way that our stuff is going to be set up, they are going to be working very much interconnectedly um, in our games. Okay. So the first item we're going to talk about is called an array. And this was one of the answers on one of our Kahoots. We didn't have a question about it, but an array was a question, but we have never talked about it. So an array is just a collection of information or data. So we're going to watch a couple of videos talking about what an array is, but just know it is essentially a list or a group. Now this is going to be a little different than the groups we're going to use in our game lab. They're slightly different than arrays, but they are similar in a lot of respects. And so this is a great time for us to start learning about arrays because it's also, we're going to be using them in similar ways you would use arrays. So we're going to have to know some of the same terminology, know some of the same ways of referring to specific items in that array. So we're going to, this would be a great place to plug that in. Then we're also going to be learning about a for loop, which is a loop that has a predetermined beginning and end, and what they call an increment. So there's going to be three different components that are going to go into our for loop. It's going to be where are we starting at, when are we ending, and how much is this thing increasing every time. So we're going to see that a little more in depth now. Just the definition of that one might sound a little confusing. We'll see it in action later on. We're going to start talking about the array first. All right. So as I said, we are going to watch some videos about this, and the videos we're going to be watching, we're going to be talking about in the context of App Lab. And we're going to briefly look at what it looks like in App Lab, but we're not going to be applying it in App Lab. But since we have used App Lab already, I figured this would be probably a good place we can kind of see how it worked in App Lab. And also these videos I thought were a good setup to talking about how we're going to use this in groups anyway. Better than the Game Lab videos, I thought. All right, pull that one up. Nope, that's the for loops. There we go. All right, so there are going to be a few videos, and I'll kind of pause and stop and talk about this in between. So the first part of this is all going to be the conceptual part, right? And then we'll go into how are we actually applying this in our game. So we have to understand what we're working with. And then once we understand what we're working with, we're going to jump forward and look at how this actually looks in our game. So I'm going to play these videos. And again, I'll be pausing them throughout and kind of explaining things as we go along. All right, so that part he got at the end, which is having multiple slots and each slot having kind of a position. That's what the next video is going to talk a little bit more in depth at. Okay. Now, we aren't going to be using this in App Lab, right? We're going to be using Game Lab. But I do want to at least show you what it looks like in App Lab. Since we've been using it, we used App Lab a lot. So hopefully we have a little bit of familiarity with it. And all of the things relating to our list are under variables. Okay, so we go to variables. We mostly just use these top ones, right? Probably, I don't think we used anything past console.log. But if we scroll down, we've got multiple commands that are specific to working with lists or arrays. So we've got a couple here that will allow us to kind of quickly build out a list, either using numbers, right? And I can add or subtract using my arrows if I'm going to use the block. As many items as I need to. Or strings, right? So I can also store strings up here. So if I wanted to store names up here, right, I could. Right, I just need to type in those quotes then. The blocks is kind of help you quickly set up one of those. And then there's also a bunch of other commands we can use with our lists. We're going to be looking at some of these today. Specifically, the next video, and ones we're going to have to be using in Game Lab, are this one to refer to a specific item, to be able to access and tell, all right, well, I want item number 3. What's item number 3 in my list, right? So that's going to be this next one here. They're going to talk about that in the next video. And also to get how long the list is. Okay, because we're going to need to do that for our groups. We're going to be doing it very similarly to how we did it here. So we're going to be doing those. Now we're also going to be adding items, but it's going to look a little bit differently in game labs. So we're not going to worry too much about that. But these two right here, we're going to have to understand how these two work, so we can learn how to apply them in our game. First one, second, no, it was that one. All right. We're going to move on to the next video that's going to talk about those location numbers, or what they're going to refer to as index numbers. All right, so I wanted that to pause. 100. Okay, so as he's explaining here now, when we use this to retrieve a specific item, right, it's going to actually be getting that item, right, or getting the value of that item, the name, the number, it's a value, if it's, you could store a Boolean value right here, right? This could be just a series of true and falses if you wanted to. It's going to retrieve that specific item when you use this index number. So in this case, since we have a bunch of numbers stored in here, we can retrieve the item at index 2, which again, it's not going to be the second item. It's going to be the third item because index number started at 0. So in this case, it's 40 plus the value being stored at index 5 in numList, which is going to be, again, the 6th value, not the 5th value, even though it's the index number is 5. So just remember, keep that in mind. Your index number is going to be 1 off from its actual location. You start at 0. So in this case, you can actually add 40 plus 60 and store it in a new variable sum. And that sum then would be equal to 40. All right, so the next part, the next thing here, now what they wanted you to do was to order these around. And if you were to actually open up this lesson on your own, now this was so short that it wasn't worth really kind of going to, they would have you drag these into place. I tried resetting this, and for some reason I can't reset this. So we can't go back to what it looked like before I already completed it. But what they wanted you to do was drag these into place, the values that are at each index location, right? So we can kind of see what this looks like a little bit. So we have an array that is called my numbers. So my numbers, we want the value at index location 4, which is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? So it's 15. Again, you start counting at 0. And that is important for later on today. We are going to be making sure we need to know that. So the second one's asking for the my numbers at index 0, which will be the actual first item, which is 32. My numbers at index location 3, 0, 1, 2, 3. Right? So it's actually 0. So just remember, your index numbers are going to be 1 off from the actual placement in the list, right? Because they start at 0. So just keep in mind, starts at 0. And that's actually going to relate to our for loops later too. Yes, I know it's the correct answer. All right, we are going to watch one more video. And then we are going to switch over, and we're going to start seeing how this looks and relates to what we're doing in GameLab. So this next part is going to be talking about using this length, as you can see from the title here, which we are going to be using shortly. The way they do in the lesson, I did look ahead because I was considering assigning this lesson, then coming back and applying it to GameLab later. But I didn't love the way that they did it. I thought it was going to get more confusing, actually, even though it would give us a chance to apply it in some capacity. So we're actually going to just start looking at how this interacts with GameLab. Okay. So I'm going to switch over to our game. So a quick reminder of where our game is at right now. If I hit run, we've got one enemy. Right now, if it runs into me, it takes away one of my lives, right? We also added last time, again, if you're up to date, the ability, oops, I didn't shoot fast enough there. The ability to shoot, and when that shot runs into our enemy, it'll destroy the enemy, right? So if the enemy runs into me, it destroys the enemy and takes away one of my lives. If I shoot the enemy, when that blast hits the enemy, it destroys the enemy. Okay. All right, so let's actually think about how this is written in our code. So I'm going to scroll down here first. So we do create the enemies, created enemy one by itself, right? So we created enemy one here at its location, set its animation, telling it what sprite to use, right? We had to scale it down a little bit because it was the one I used was way too big. And I also had to rotate it. Okay, so that's going to come back a little bit later when we're thinking about that. I'm going to skip over some of this for now. When we down here, where we actually gave the enemy some velocity, we had to do it. We did it individually, right? We told it specifically enemy one. If we have 100 enemies, we would then have to tell each enemy how fast to go, which could be a big pain in the butt. Also, what would also be a big pain is right now in our enemies collide function, we checked enemy one specifically. So we said, is enemy one touching player? And if enemy one is touching player, destroy that enemy. If we do it this way, we're going to have to recode this to run every single enemy we may add in this game. Now, this game probably won't be too big, but it has the potential to be enormous, right? Again, we could get to the point where we have 100 enemies. Do we want to code for each individual enemy? It would take a very long time. We could, but it would take a very long time. Now, an alternative here is we could add a parameter to this function, similar to how we did it in AppLab, right? And we could say, I don't know, maybe name, call it name, right? And then I could run this instead of enemy one, I could run it on name and name. And then when I run, I could run this function on each individual enemy. But then I still have to run the function 100 times for each individual enemy, right? I'm going to undo that. I'm going to go back to how it was. There we go. All right. Same thing when we get down to shoot. So, right, this first part all has to do with just the blast coming out of the ship. But then when we see if the blast is touching the enemy, right, to know if it needs to destroy something, right now I'm specifically checking enemy one. Again, this could take a very long time for me to code up manually if I end up with hundreds of enemies, if I have a very large game. So one way we can get around this and simplify things significantly is by using groups, which is what GameLab has kind of created as kind of a similar structure to arrays. Arrays are the most common thing you'll see like this in coding in general. So if you take other coding classes, you go to, again, computer science class in college or later on in life, you're going to hear about arrays. Groups are kind of specific to AppLab, at least the way that they've created them here, but we're going to treat them in similar methods. All right. So first thing I'm going to do to kind of demonstrate how this is going to work is I'm going to create a second enemy. So this part will be pretty easy. So I'm going to do it this very similar way to how I did it up here for enemy one. So in fact, I'm going to even use the same image. I'm going to use the same sprite for enemy two. So I'm going to create another one. I'm going to create the same way that I created the first one. So I'm going to go to sprites. I'm going to go to var sprites. I'm going to do this underneath enemy one. I'm going to call this one enemy two. I'm going to have to think about where I want to create this sprite. So remember, this is my X and my Y. My Y, I'm going to want to be the same as enemy one because I'm going to have the ship be next to it, right? So I still want to be the same location vertically. So I'm gonna set that to 50, the same way that one is set. My X, though, I probably want it a little bit further over. I'm gonna have it next to the ship, right? If I do it 200, they're both gonna be at 200 and then 50, right? 200X, so they'll be on top of each other. I want the second one next to it. So I'm gonna change this, and I'm gonna move it to the right. So I'm gonna try 300. Now, just like I did up here, I need to set the sprite or the animation I'm going to use for enemy 2. And I'm going to use this. I'm going to use the same ship for this one. Then I'm going to do, because I already know I'm going to have to scale it and rotate, so I'm going to use the same blocks again. Enemy 2, and I'm scaling to 0.2. And remember, if you don't put that 0 there, the code will run, but it will give you a warning, because that's not like best practice. They call it a leading decimal when you don't have the 0 there. And it can be confusing because we do use this, as you can see right here, enemy2.scale, right? So it'll be hard to read and possibly even throw us off if we have just this period there, because it's like, is it a dot or is it a decimal point? Which one is it? So that's why they recommend you don't do it. So I'm going to use 0.2. I'm going to rotate it, same way I did before. And I'm rotating it 90, just like that. Okay. So now if I reset this and I run it again, I do have that second ship. You'll notice, obviously, enemy 2 not moving. Right? If I shoot it, my blast is going to go through it because I don't have code in there to tell it what to do if my blast is touching enemy 2. Right now, my code is only telling me what to do if my blast touches enemy 1. So again, I could go down there and I could just redo all of the same code I did for enemy 2 that I did for enemy 1, but that's going to be too big of a pain, I think. We're going to start using groups. All right. So they do have this whole collection to use with our groups right here. So that's where a lot of our code we're going to be using with groups is. Not all of it, but a lot of it is going to be here. Unlike in App Lab, as we saw, a lot of the stuff with lists was under variables. There's none of that list stuff under here. Okay, so a lot of similar things we're going to be doing is under this groups category. All right, so to create a group, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable that's going to hold on to that group. And I'm going to put this right underneath my enemy 2 code. So I'm just going to call this enemies. And then I have to tell it to add both enemy 1 and enemy 2 to this group. So I'm going to go to group.add, do enemy 1. Oh, no, never mind. That's not the way I want to do it. I want to say the group name first, enemies. Oop. And I'm adding enemy 1 to that group, enemy 1. There we go. And then I want to do group.add again. And I'm adding 2 enemies, enemy 2. All right, so now I have 2 items in this group, which again, our group is going to be very similar and related to how arrays worked, as we saw in the video. All right, so the first thing I could do is, let's say, again, I'm going to have a bunch of enemies. I can do some of these things I already did to my entire group instead of individually. So for example, I'm using the same sprite here. I need to scale and rotate that sprite the same amount every time I use it. So if that's the case, I can delete all of these lines of code, enemy 1.scale, enemy 1.rotation, enemy 2.scale, enemy 2.rotation, and apply that scale and rotation to the entire group. Now, if you are using, in your game, you use different sprites for different enemies that are different sizes, right? And aren't going to be scaled the same amount or don't have to be rotated the same way. You don't want to do this to the whole group. But since I'm using the same one, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this code, right? I'll get rid of the scale and rotation for both those. If I hit run right now, it's going to look really awful, right? But I'm going to tell it to scale and rotate everything in my group. So I'm going to scroll down. You'll see a lot. Some of these are similar to some of the commands we've seen in other places. So like under sprites. And some of them look slightly different. So for example, here, we've got set scale each. Right? So instead of dot scale, this is dot set scale each. And I'm going to tell it everything in enemies. I'm going to set that scale to 0.2. Right. Now, if I add a third enemy using the same sprite, I don't have to add the code to scale it because it's going to automatically be done here. So I'm going to set scale each, and then I'm going to do set rotation each. Again, this is just, ooh, hello. Type that in, right? There we go. And it already has 90 in there. So we're all done. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and hit run. And now it's kind of back to where we just had it, right? So
that's crazy. Also, I just made s'mores.
So that's going to be getting us kind of back to where we were, right? But so in this case, we already had the code in there, so it wouldn't make our life simpler. We could have left it the way it was. But if we're going to be using similar sprites and we're going to have like 50 of them, this is going to make our lives much better. Okay. All right. So this is the first way we can that groups can kind of help simplify things. The other place I'm going to use it that's going to be a relatively simple line of code is for my velocity. You do not want to get rid of the variable codes for each enemy. So you do still need to make your enemies individually through variables and set the sprites for them. So unlike what they did with the array, where they're like, don't create things individually, in our case, we do have to create things individually and then add them to the group. You can get rid of, yes, but setting the scale and rotation individually, that is optional. That part's optional, Chris, but you do need to make sure that you are still creating, yes, each individual enemy and setting the sprite. Okay. All right, so one other place I'm going to do this is I'm going to go down to my draw loop. Remember my draw function, which kind of functions as my game loop here. And inside of my my draw function, one of the things I had in here was my enemy1.velocity y. So that was giving my enemy1 ship some velocity. I could, again, come down here and I put enemy2.velocity y and give that one separate velocity. But I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of this. And again, I'm still under groups. And if I scroll down, you can see I've got group.setVelocityY y each. And I'm going to set that velocity y for everything in my enemies group. I think I had that set to 5 before, so I'm going to go ahead and set that to 5. Now I can see both of my ships, both my enemy ships have velocity now. Now, if I go over to the second one, you'll see that one doesn't do damage to me still. And if I shoot at it, it does not still take damage, right? Okay. So far, everything we've done with groups, not too complicated. We're essentially just telling it, hey, this thing I was doing to one sprite before, now do it to everything that is in this group, right? So the only completely new thing we really need to think about is creating that group and then adding the items to that group. All right, now things are going to get a little more complicated when we think about how we want to adjust some of our functions, though. So right now, we're going to be looking at enemies collide first. And right now it's checking only enemy 1. So if enemy 1 is touching the player, enemy 1 dot destroy, right? And then also lives equals lives minus 1, subtract 1 lives. For the set velocity each, that is under groups, that command. It's towards the bottom. And then again, that's going to set velocity for every item in that group. And I got rid of the velocity for just enemy 1 that was there before. All right, so now coming back to my enemies collide function, we're going to have to do this in a little bit of a different way. This is going to be a little more confusing, and this is going to connect much more to what we were talking about at the beginning of class with the arrays, specifically those index numbers. Remember, like each item in an array has a location, right? Starting with 0. So the first item in an array or in our group is going to be item number 0. The second number will be index number 1. Okay, so that's an important thing to remember. We need to think about that. The way to retrieve how many items are in an array is using dot length. Okay, and that's going to come into play here in a second. And now we're ready to learn about our for loops. So we're going to watch a short, brief video on for loops. Before we can think about how we're going to use that for loop in conjunction to what we learned about arrays at the beginning of class to run our function on everything that's inside of that enemies group. Okay, so we're probably not going to watch this whole video because some of it kind of doesn't totally apply to what we're doing. But we're going to watch at least the beginning part of this video here. This one right here. Okay, so we're not going to watch the rest of the video here. So when we pull up the for loop in our game lab, it's going to look slightly different. It's going to be the same thing, but instead of only being able to input this one number, we're going to be able to change multiple things. We're not going to, but I am going to explain what each part of that actually is telling you. Okay. So in this example, they only had the ability to input the number here, which was counting how many times this loop is going to run, which is what we're going to do. So we're only going to tell it to run a certain number of times. But it is kind of important to at least have an idea of what these items actually mean, right? Like what var I equals 0, I less than 200, I plus plus. We're not going to worry about it too much, but I do want to give you some explanation about what each part of that means and how it's going to relate to how we're going to use it with our groups. So I'm going to switch back over to Game Lab here. All right, so I'm going to start building this out in my function, but I'm going to leave my initial conditional in here, my initial if statement, just so I can kind of use it for reference. Okay, so we're going to be creating something similar to what the initial if statement in here was, but now we wanted to check every item inside of our enemies group. And right now that's only 2 items, but further down the road, we could have 20 items in our enemies group. So 20 enemies, and we don't have to want to code each one individually. It's going to take forever, right? So we're going to solve that problem using our for loop. So I'm going to leave this here for reference. We're going to get rid of it at the end. So I'm going to start with going to control and bringing in a for loop, which is the first thing in control. And I'm going to drag it directly under my if statement for now. Again, I'm going to get rid of this later, but for now. Okay. All right, so inside of here, this actually is set up the same way it was in the example video, but now they give us the ability to edit all of these fields. We actually aren't going to edit all of these. We're only going to edit the same one that they changed in the video, which is where this 4 is now. But I'm going to give you some explanation about what these things mean because they didn't really explain that in the video. So this first part, var I equals 0, this is our initial value for our counter. So your for loop is going to kind of have a temporary variable that's going to act just as a counter. Okay. Now, traditionally in JavaScript, at least in a lot of other languages, they will use the letter I for this value. You don't have to, right? I could come in here and I could call it something else, or sometimes you have to call it something else when you get more advanced. We're not going to worry about that right now. We're going to leave it named I. Okay. Our initial value is also going to remain 0. Now, if you're just doing a regular total count, you're going to probably leave it at 0. There are some times when you'd want to change it, but again, we're not going to worry about that for now. Okay. And actually, in our case, starting it at 0 is going to work to our advantage. Okay, I'll explain that in a little bit. The next part is, how long should this repeat for, right? How many times? And this right here is saying, as long as I is less than 4, keep running. So that essentially what this means is repeat 4 times. This last one is called the increment, and that means how much is I increasing every time this loop runs. I plus plus just means increase by 1. Okay, this is the most commonly used type of increment in a for loop. Sometimes you might be increasing it differently, but this works perfectly. So what I plus plus means, we haven't looked at this notation before, but we are familiar with what this is actually doing. So the longer way of coding this, same exact thing, is this right here. You don't have to code this. This is just me showing you what this is actually, what this means in a longer format. I plus plus is the same way of, another way of putting that, as we've done before, is I equals I plus 1. Okay. So I plus plus is the same. Another way of putting that we've done before is I equals I plus 1. So take what I is currently and add 1 to it. So this just means every time this loop runs, add 1 to this number. Okay. Add 1 to our counter. We haven't looked at this notation before again, but this actually works in other places. So we can use this in other ways with our various variables. We're not going to worry about that right now. Okay. Main thing we need to know about the for loop, our counter is set to 0. We're going to loop this thing 4 times. And every time this loop finishes, increase that counter by 1. Okay. That's what these numbers at the top mean. That's what all this information means. It is important to know we are going to be changing how many times it needs to run, but the rest of it we're not going to change for now. Okay. So we hopefully understand a little bit about how that loop is set up. The main thing we need to focus on right now is just how many times should this loop repeat. And how we're going to be using it is we want this loop to run over every item in our array or in our group. So we want it to run, going back to thinking about way earlier in class, we want this to run for as many items as is in our array or in our group. And we have a handy dandy command to tell us that, right? Because right now we only have 2 items in that group, right? So we could come in here and we could say I less than 2. Except for, there it goes. That's like too much. I less than 2, right? And we're going to tell it to loop 2 times. But down the road, we might have more enemies. And so we don't want to put a number in there, because then we're going to have to keep coming down and we're going to have to be like, okay, well, now I've got 20 enemies. Now I have to change this number to 20. It's going to be just another thing you got to keep track of, another thing you could forget, right? Giving yourself more work as a coder. So instead of telling it an actual number, we're going to use, if I go to groups, actually, did they give us a block for this? I don't think they give us a block for this. Nope, we're gonna have to type it in. They don't give us a block for this. We're gonna tell it to give us, run it for as many items as is in the enemy's group. So we're gonna do this the same way they showed us to use it for array. So we're gonna type in enemies. Oh, getting lag right now, come on. Enemies, start typing. There we go. Dot length. So again, that's the same way they showed us how to do it with our arrays earlier in class, right? And enemies.length is going to produce the number of all the items that are inside of that group. So what we're telling this is loop repeats for as many items as we have in the group. Any questions on that? That's not too tricky, hopefully. All right. So again, this is the only item we need to change here. So even if you're like, I'm a little shaky on what I is, why we're using I, the only thing we really have to change is how many times is this loop repeating, which is this field right here. And we're repeating it for enemies.length, which is the number of items in our enemies group. Okay. Any questions at this point? All right. Okay, so we're going to repeat this. And what we're going to be repeating is checking if each enemy is touching the player. So we're going to use a similar structure to how this if statement is set up above, but we're going to have to make a couple of tweaks, a couple of small changes. So I'm going to get an if statement. So I'm going to go to control. I'm using just a regular if statement, same way I did here, not an if else. And I'm going to actually drag that same is touching block into the if statement as I had up here, which is under sprites. I'm actually going to grab that out of sprites, not out of groups. So I'm going to go to sprites. I'm going to find is touching, sprite.is touching target. All right. And I am going to type in player into the second field. All right. So as we set up here, though, we don't want to type in enemy one into this field, though, because then it's going to just check enemy. And unfortunately, we can't just type in enemies and have it just do all of the enemies. What we're going to do is we're going to use a new block or new command that's under groups. And if I scroll up here, it's going to be group.getI. And group.getI is going to retrieve the item or the enemy at I, which is the index number. So it's going to be getting the enemy at a certain location in our group. Remember, all of our items are listed, right? So I'm going to do group.getI, and I'm going to drag this right into where it says sprite. Oh, is it going to let me? Oh, great. I think I'm going to have to type it in because it just automatically converted it to group.get 0, which is not what I want. Okay. I'm going to have to type this one in. So I'm going to go back and type or get my is touching again and change this to player. Okay. So in Sprite, I'm going to be typing this command in instead of dragging it. Can't drag it, unfortunately. But I'm going to be using the same setup, which is group.getI. I'm going to go into Sprite, and I'm going to type the group name. I'm not going to type the word group, right? I'm going to type in enemies. .get and put my parentheses. Same way I did, they have it set up here on the command if you forget how to do it. And instead of typing in a number to give a specific index number, I'm going to type in, I am going to leave it the same way it is in that command, which is I. Now, when I click out, it is going to convert it the same way it was when I dragged it in. But now, instead of having 0, it says I in here. So what's going to happen is when my loop runs, let's say the first time, right? I've created this I variable. Well, I didn't create it, but it was already in there. And this I is initially set to 0. So the first time that this loop runs, it's going to get my enemy at location 0, at index 0, and ask, is the enemy at index 0 touching the player? Now, my enemy at index 0 is the first thing in my enemies group, which is, right now, the first thing I added to enemies, which is enemy 1. So the first time this loop runs, it's going to ask if enemy 1, which is what the result of this is touching player. So if enemy 1 is touching player, I'm going to make sure it's destroyed and also subtract 1 of my lives. Okay. So I'm going to use that destroy, same way I did here, and I'm going to do sprites. So dot destroy. There it is, almost all the way at the bottom. And again, I'm going to have to type this in. I'm going to type the same thing I used up here, enemies.getI. I don't know why it wants to turn that into a solid thing I can't go back and change. It's part of the reason why Game Lab is doing what it's doing. Okay. So what this means, again, is going to, every time this loop runs, it's going to get the enemy at the index that is equal to this I number. So the first time it runs, I is equal to 0. So enemy at index 0, enemies at index 0 is going to be enemy 1. So it's enemy 1 touching player. Yes. Destroy enemy 1. Okay. I also do need to make sure I put in this, which is going to look exactly the same as it does up here. So I'm going to go to variables and put that in. Lives equals lives minus 1. Like that. All right. So this right here is actually my completed code. So the first time this runs, remember, it's going to be checking my I is set to 0. That's my counter. But I'm also going to use that I number when I'm checking my indexes. So the first time this runs, it's going to check the enemy at index 0, which is enemy 1. Is enemy 1 touching the player? If so, destroy enemy 1. If not, it's going to loop back over. And it's going to run for I is going to increase by 1 the second time this loop runs. So now I is equal to 1. So when it checks my condition, it's checking my enemy at index 1, which is going to be this, remember, the second thing. So that's where we can get confused with the index number versus location. It's checking my second enemy, which is enemy 2. And it says it's going to be if enemy 2 is touching the player, enemy 2 dot destroy and lives minus 1. And it's going to loop over for as long as my enemies list is, or enemy group. All right, so this is actually all the code we need to add today. I'm actually going to get rid of this if, drag it over here, and I'm going to run this and check it. Make sure if this works correctly, when I run into enemy 1, I should lose a life. And if I run into enemy 2, I should lose a life, which was not the case before. So I'm going to actually try to get right between them here. I ran into both. Both were destroyed. And I lost 2 lives. So when I add a third enemy to this group, this code is already set up to work on enemy number 3. And I don't have to come down here and change anything at all. Okay. This, when I add a third enemy, now when this runs, it's going to get enemies.length is going to be equal to 3. And this will repeat 3 times. Every time that I increasing by 1. So it's going to just keep checking each item in the group. So the code for this can be a little tricky, but well, the concept is a little tricky. The code itself is not that difficult, right? All right. So that's all we have to do for this code for today. What we'll be doing next time is kind of touching base. That's what we're gonna be doing next class. And also we are gonna make a small change because we're also gonna check to see change the blast. So if you're feeling comfortable with this and you want to get a head start, you can actually do the same process on the blast. Otherwise, we're going to do that next time. Okay. Any questions? I know this is a little tricky. I'm going to be uploading the video. It might not go up today because I have to leave right now in order to get to the center. So by the time the video finishes like converting and stuff, I might already be gone. It might be up by tomorrow, but take a look at the video. Try to do it on your own. The code itself is not that difficult. It's the concept here that can be tricky. Any questions before we go?